We are back. Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project. I'm Rob Calvarowski, and as always, we have the yin to my yang, the maverick, Susan Hobson. Susan, how are you?
I am fabulous. It's Friday and it is a white outside my window right now. So I'm feeling very Canadian today. How about you, sir?
I'm all right, actually, and that's where I want to start today. There's a quote from Buddha, and he says, "With our thoughts, we make the world." And we talk about this as transitioning from a high achiever to a high performer. And over the last few days, well, I guess 2 days, I've lost internet for 24 hours, was on phone support with Shaw and had them in my house last night. It's still not fixed.
Uh,
Winston, he got neutered last week and he's wearing like a little onesie jumpsuit. And I took him out twice yesterday, but I forgot to like roll it up so he peed in the jumpsuit.
oh
That was
no.
totally on me, but it was just like one was 5 a.m. and the other one was like 10 o'clock last night. And then also last night he was up like 3 and 4 and 5, and it's been quite a nightmare. And yet I am not as, I'm not really that frustrated. And I know
Hmm.
that not long ago I would be on full blown tilt. And that's where I think people that's where we started with the quote, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
we can be our best friends and we can be our worst enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And it all starts with ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, how's that for a kickoff on a Friday morning?
All I can say is welcome to parenthood, buddy. I love seeing you in this new leadership role. I have to say, I don't love that you didn't sleep last night, obviously, but I mean, the state that you're in as you're sharing the story, you can tell, right? It's night and day from how that would have hit you maybe a couple of years ago. So we are very happy to hear that. And we're very excited about our guest today. So why don't you go ahead and introduce her to our fabulous peeps?
Absolutely. So we have a special guest, someone who's also a fan of the show. And we started talking actually on one of the posts that came out. And it's Sarah Powell, and she's a consultant for resilience, well-being, DEI, and the future of work. Sarah, how are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on today.
No, we love to have you. Now, Sarah, for everyone out there who's new to you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and like how did you arrive at doing the organizational work that you do?
Well, interestingly enough, back in 2004, when I was, knee deep in graduate school studying medical anthropology, I was looking at culture writ large, right? So looking at the intersection of things like pandemic and health and healing, culture, society, history, what those intersections were all about. And, through the years, I've really just gravitated more and more to look at organizations that exist within these larger cultures, but have cultures of their own, right? So, and even subcultures of their own. So I'm very interested in organizational culture and understanding, how leadership fits into that, how organizational psychology fits into that. So it's sort of, those are the components that contribute or detract from what organizations are trying to achieve ultimately.
Wow. We're going to have so much fun on this show. I can already tell. Sarah, tell our audience, a question we love to ask our guests is, what does leadership mean to you? And especially as it pertains to what you just riffed on there, organizational health, and all of this in and around the cultures of these organizations within the larger context of the world and our communities.
Well, Susan and Rob, I think that, one of the things we have to think about first is that we are not in the same place we were 100 years ago or even 70 years ago. And sometimes I think about this as leadership 2.0 or management 2.0. We have this toolbox of what has worked historically, but that toolbox doesn't necessarily work today. And so the most astute and the most kind of tuned in leaders are seeing that they have to shift from these older tools to really create what they want to create, which is to enable people to innovate, to do amazing things, to have audacious goals. And that really requires a different set of skills. A lot of time, there's so much attention right now being paid to, emotional intelligence, to psychological safety, to how to cultivate that. So many people still don't really understand what those tools mean. And they also don't necessarily realize how absolutely critical they are to really have a new, product, basically. We're not on the factory floor being watched by a manager from above, panopticon style.
Mm-hmm.
We are creating and innovating, and it just requires completely different leadership. So leadership is about enabling people to do their very best, right? Really enabling them. But that's not the only piece there of the puzzle. There's other things that leaders really need to do to model what they have to model themselves, what they want to see in their people. And that's, I think, tough, to be that person all the time, modeling the way and really sharing a vision of what the future could be for that organization. So it's really an interesting time, because I think we're in what's probably a long transition. I mean, it's going to take, be interesting to see where we are in 50 years. But I do love all this attention being paid to what we call soft skills, what I think of as human skills, what are the most difficult skills, right? They take your entire life to learn. And yet we underestimate how incredibly critical they are to this.
And so maybe going there a little bit, like what is, like, it's really hard to kind of, everyone talks about culture, right? We want a great culture. So like,
Right.
What is organizational culture? Like, how do you define it? And then if leaders are looking to sort of change it in that way towards this leadership 2.0, where people can be open, sharing ideas, innovating, all these things, like how do they wrap their heads around, like, what's that transition going to look like?
Yeah, amazing question. I think you're right. I think organizational culture feels like a very vague idea. And I don't think a lot of people really can get their arms around what that is. So if I was to dial back as an anthropologist, I'm going to look at culture as, shared values, norms, behaviors. Think about, like, Susan, I'm grasping that you're a Canadian, right? I went to McGill for graduate school, and, I'm an American. So even though we share certain cultural things in common, there's definitely differences. And when I was living in Canada, I really could pick up on some of the sort of these underpinnings, this very implicit ways of behaving, of understanding each other, maybe assumptions that underlie how we operate in life, right? So what are those assumptions that we have about people, about maybe the goodness of people, or the, all these kinds of very deep assumptions and deep stories that we have and that we share culturally. So that would be like the big picture of culture. Now, Ed Schein is kind of a historic business thinker around this, and he wrote about this model where he really, if you picture kind of an iceberg, you've got on the very top the artifacts, what we see. So when you think about an organizational culture, what are the things I can see really obviously? How people dress, how they behave in meetings, kind of what are the things that we project that our culture is. Then underneath that iceberg, you have these other deeper structures. And so those are the values that are the real values. We can say these are our values as an organization, but what's really valued? And maybe we're not talking about that per se, but we have a kind of understanding. Like maybe we're saying, we want our people to achieve the greatest success or to innovate. But underneath it all, we don't actually value the things that enable that innovation, right? And then underneath that are those shared assumptions again, the bigger picture things that really people are not going to talk about a lot, but that we all sort of begin to understand are there. Now, if you're thinking about how do I influence the change to that culture, then I need to understand, how do people feel like they belong in that community? Do they have a shared identity that's connected to that culture? That's really, if you want people to commit to that cultural vision, what does that look like? And how do we forge that? How do we create shared identity? You're probably already thinking about organizational cultures that do that really well. And they very intentionally put things in place. Again, these could be the artifacts and trying to understand, does the artifact of what I'm saying about our people and our culture actually match how we live and how we operate? Listen, we spend how many hours a week at work? It's an enormous part of our time. So that stuff's really important. Then there's this idea of reciprocity, right? And Brene Brown, she broke down trust in this wonderful model called braving, which is actually my favorite model of trust. And she really is like, what are the things that tangibly make up trust? One thing that she hits on is reciprocity. And I really love that because we often think about helping one another. Like, you trust me because I'm there for you. Susan, Rob, you have a problem. I've got that stick of butter, that cup of sugar. I'm going to give that to you. I'm going to help you out. But one thing that's so critical is it works both ways. We don't have trust until I can ask you for help too. Or you can ask me for help and we help each other. That's the same thing in the workplace. Now, some cultures have reciprocity, but it's negative reciprocity. It's transactional. And it's, if I do this for you, you owe me. Or it's a zero-sum game. We're competing. And yeah, maybe I'll give you a leg up now, but I want to win in the end. And there's only one winner. So that's going to break down that sense of community and identity, right? And if you have, I think that this is where we look at those old models of leadership, like 1.0, very command and control, watching you, looking to see what you're doing every second of the day. That erodes trust and it erodes reciprocity, and it isn't about enabling at all. So there are very deliberate things that companies can do that, or even just to question, if I implement, let's say, monitoring my people who are working remotely on their desktops, what is that going to do? Well, we know what it's going to do. It's going to erode trust and it's going to erode a sense of commitment and confidence. We know this, right? We have decades of research behind this. Finally, there is this, phenomenon, which is so in business school, I remember coming up against all these case studies, and I was, about different mergers and acquisitions. And I was astonished at how many fail because of everyday resistance. Just resist, right? So if I don't like what's happening, people on an individual and then on a cultural level, like kind of it starts individually and then it starts to feel normal. And then it starts to just sort of look like it's part of the culture, this just resistance. And so these massive M&As have totally fallen apart for no other reason than cultural problems. And it's like, this is so important. Why? How could we let that happen? Well, I think that we still look at culture as the icing on the cake when it's the cake. Like, it is the cake. If you don't deal with the culture, like, you are not going to succeed. But yet we're kind of like, oh yeah, we know that. It's sort of like random. We'll let this it happen. people kind of think we don't have any say, maybe. Or
yeah. What
influence.
is that reason? I'm curious,
I think that we take it for granted. So I don't know. I was talking with a senior leader a few weeks ago, and he was like, "Oh, organizational culture. Yeah, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that that's a thing." And he's like, "We don't even have a culture." And I'm like, "You do though." You do. And if you're thinking that this is a sidebar issue, you're missing out. And so we kind of need to pull these things together, right? So diversity, equity, and inclusion, well-being. These are things that are underneath it all, right? Diversity, think about diversity. How can you have innovative, forward-thinking teams if you don't have diversity of perspective, thought, cognition, cultural background, ethnic background, all the things that come together that just create this extremely creative, explosive environment of interesting ideas and different perspectives. If I walk into a room and it's all me, how are you going to have that? You're not going to have it, right? Equity, it has to feel fair. The culture I'm in, I need to feel like I can succeed just as much as you can, Rob, or that you can, Susan. Like there's got to be a sense of I can succeed here. It doesn't matter how I'm different from everyone else, right? And inclusion is the linchpin here. Belonging. If I don't belong, I'm not committed. And there was someone I was speaking to recently about this, and she said one of the things. So this is a VP of Talent and Inclusion at Comcast, Barb Dorsey, and she was talking about how everyone can remember what it feels like to not belong. So it's like, imagine that for a second. Remember when you were in middle school, right? We all had that experience at some point of you're in a space and you're really conscious of the fact I don't belong, or people are excluding me deliberately. How am I going to do my best work in that situation? I'm not. You think I'm going to be innovative and creative when I feel like I don't fit in and I'm not part of the community? Not a chance. So this is like, we can talk about organizational culture, but if you're just giving lip service to things like DEI and that's a sidebar, or well-being and that's a sidebar, or organizational culture and all you're doing is kind of putting out marketing campaigns about, International Women's Day or some kind of event, everybody knows it. It feels hypocritical. It's not like you magically create this. So I hope that comes across clearly, but these are all interlocking. And I'm telling you, it's going to be fascinating to see who succeeds in this kind of future of work where you have to bring this intention to hybrid work models, or, people coming together only twice a year because 25% of the workforce is working remotely. We're going to have to bring more intention than ever to these kinds of things.
Yeah, I feel like that's something we really got to riff on, right? Is like we're obviously going through a ton of disruption in the world. Like you just mentioned, a lot of companies are moving to remote work, if not for the next year, permanently. So I got to imagine this is a time where we should be thinking about this concept the most. I mean, certainly if we understand what Sarah's laying down here, which is this whole explanation of how this correlates to performance, right? Like that's essentially what you're saying, right? Is organizational culture correlates to how well your team is going to be able to perform and create and impact. So
100%.
Yeah. And so if that wasn't clear pre-pandemic and all this disruption in the world, I have to imagine this is becoming more evident than ever because people are having such issues in terms of the engagement of their people, trying to lead remotely, like things that they just maybe never had to do before, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you're right. It is, again, this is part of that new toolkit, right? Like the things that worked for us in our previous iteration of work, or how we were, co-located or things like that, they're not going to work in the same way. I'm not saying that we can't come up with solutions. I think we can come up with amazing solutions. So a lesson that I learned, which I was really curious about, I was going to be managing a global team, truly distributed, not another person in North America, all over the world. You know, you had to do the 6 a.m. meeting, and the poor guy in Australia, it's 11 p.m. for him. You know, it's just like this really tough time zone issue.
Yeah.
And I thought, can you really develop these wonderful team dynamics when everyone's remote and you're really not going to meet in person, or if you are, it's going to be pretty infrequent, like really infrequent. And I learned 100%. You can actually develop love for your team, you know, to have that connection remotely. You can do it, but you have to be really intentional. How do I create these spaces where we can have personal conversations, where people can just drop by and visit me, you know, office hours. Hi, you know, let's talk about your vacation, you know, or, oh, you're bringing me a tough work problem. Let's try to solve that. You have to create that same kind of environment that you might take for granted in person. And I think a lot of companies haven't quite grasped that yet. In fact, what they're doing is 30-minute meetings back to back, where every single thing is purely transactional and work related. Well, you're not going to build any connection at all, except for work connection. And that's just not going to be enough for that culture to really thrive and develop.
What comes back to what you mentioned, right, is if it's very transactional, you don't actually foster an environment of belonging. You're just fostering an environment of, this is what I do, and that's it.
Yep.
And that's where some of the aspects of like the great resignation or the reshuffle are coming into play, right? Is people don't feel like they belong, so they're looking for that somewhere else. Or it becomes a purely monetary type of transaction where you're like, hey, they're going to pay me more, so I'm out the door.
Definitely true.
I mean, it's clearly possible to foster that stuff, because Susan and I have never met in person at all.
It's awesome.
Yeah. That theory correct right there. It reminds me of like the factory. You're talking about how this 1.0 leadership is born in an industrial era, like 100 years ago. We're in the factory on the line with our superior looking down from the Ivy Tower above. That's what transactional means, right? It's just like there's no emotional connection to what it is that you're actually doing with these people. And that's where the soft skills come in.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. Those human skills. But it's like, what are we asking people to do?
Yeah.
You know, are you asking someone to attach one widget to another widget in as fast as possible? Or are you asking people to innovate? Like, innovation doesn't come from nowhere. Yeah. And you need, there's just so much interesting work about, I love Cal Newport's work around deep work. And, there's just the whole concept of flow and how we achieve flow. And you need downtime. You need fun interactions with people. You need to be able to riff and think about it. I think that there's so many cool ways that if we were very intentional, again, you have to be intentional about this. You create new norms and ways of working that foster what you want. And it shouldn't just be left to chance, because it just won't necessarily happen at all if you just sort of let that happen, And
so that's where I think a lot of leaders sort of fall, right? And it's a lot of what we had in the office was somewhat left to chance, where, hey, we would meet in the hallway, hey, we would meet at the coffee machine, or, it was like we would have a ton of informal meetings where you're just standing around at your desks and you're just chatting. And I think now it's because that doesn't exist anymore, because the coffee machine at my house is different than one at your house. Right? It's like, unless you set that up, you're not going to randomly bump into anybody.
Right.
So I guess, Sarah, like, we're talking a little bit about some foundational elements here. In the work that you do, like when people are trying to move towards this leadership 2.0, what are some of the mistakes you see them make?
Well, I think one mistake is not adequately preparing managers. And I really think that this is a key element here. We're saying to managers, look, this is all important. Got to have psychological safety. Okay, good luck. Have fun with that. And what you have is this massive discrepancy between managers who incorporate leadership launchpad lessons, right? And those who have no idea, or they're like, yeah, but this always worked for me. I always had this very top-down hierarchy and it worked. People got the job done. Or what does it mean for me to be a manager at all? What's my responsibility? I thought it was to deliver the right bottom line, the right metrics. That's what I thought my job was. Wait, you're telling me now I'm supposed to take care of my people? I don't know what that even means, right? So we're not preparing managers for this. And
totally
organizations have to be like, okay, we want to achieve this. How do you create managers who are consistently and across the board doing the things necessary to achieve what we want to achieve? Susan, I feel like you were about to say something there.
No, I just think that it's exactly the same conversation that I have day in and day out with a lot of these leaders who first come through my door at the 1.0 stage, right? It's just like that. It's shocking to me in 2022 that this is such a huge blind spot, right? That leaders are not getting properly informed or educated or empowered in regards to what leadership actually means. That's why we start with that question on this show, because it's like a way of getting into alignment. Are we talking about the same thing here? Because I think that there's a huge gap there. There's a huge gap there in terms of, there's so many awesome all-star individual contributors. They're just promoted to leadership, right? And they don't know any different. They just keep doing as they always did in their own way, try to get results.
It's so funny. I mean, think about higher education for a second, totally different kind of environment. You've got people who are in research, who are excellent researchers, who, are getting great NSF grants or, high level grants, and they're pulling in millions of dollars for the organization. Awesome. Then they get promoted to chair of the department or even dean. And dean is leadership for the entire school, whatever that school might be, communications, science and technology, whatever it might be.
Right.
They've never received 1 second of training about how to lead. And by the time they get there, they're like, well, I've succeeded. I'm dean. I don't need any training because I won. I got the title. I got the prize. Yeah. So they come to a place where they no longer believe that they need any of that skill development. And it's the same in the corporate world. It's the same in all organizations where we promote people up based on the skills that they had, without saying, you know what, this new role is going to require you to develop these new skills. And we're going to work with you on that. We're going to help you develop, because part of humility is also realizing you have a blind spot or you don't know what you don't know. Like this is like, there's so many things connected here, right? Like I have to, as a leader, have that humility to say, what am I missing? What should I be doing better? Versus, well, I arrived, didn't I? So clearly I know what I'm doing. It's
fascinating because it wakes up so much insecurity in a leader who is all of a sudden made aware of the fact that there's more to this role than maybe they're prepared to show up and execute on. And I think that itself is some of the resistance, right? Is that
you're so right.
It wakes up the insecurity, and then all of a sudden that's where the avoidance will kick in.
Which is why I think it is funny, because I think people who are in this all the time, thinking about this all the time, do take for granted that yeah, don't we all know this by now? Like,
I agree.
Isn't this kind of just pretty well understood? You need to have self-awareness and et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, people really, really have a hard time with that. And
I concur.
So I do have a strong background in crisis mental health. And it is interesting, you know, really trying to understand, why do people go into fight or flight mode when they receive feedback, right? So what is triggering the threat response? And what do we do to diminish that so that they stop seeing this as a threat and they start seeing it as a challenge? Because that's the difference, right? Like, if you're facing a situation that's stressful, there's some kind of massive stressor, the calculus that is not cognitive, but is totally about your limbic system, is assessing, do I have the resources to meet this demand, whatever it is? Do I have the resources? So again, not conscious, it's happening underneath it all. And if we are facing a tiger on the savannah, our whole kind of instinctual autonomic nervous system is saying, get the hell out of here, you know, like run, get away. And if you can't, you have to fight. If you're getting feedback, that is not the same thing, but it activates that unless we can pivot to, I do have the resources to meet this.
That's why mindset is everything.
It's important.
I have to say, right? Because it's all about the framing of that opportunity. And that's, I use the word opportunity to sort of model that, right? Because it's like, if you lean in and you're excited because you see this as an opportunity for their growth, that gets them excited. It's like a totally different reception than, you know, you sitting down and saying, okay, we got to talk about your performance here. You ready? Right. It's a different frame, so it lands differently. Sorry, Rob.
No, it's also where we start. And this is a lot of the self-work that we teach, is what are our beliefs about ourselves in the context of anything, but it can be also in the context of work. So if our foundational belief about ourselves is, if I'm not perfect, then I am a failure, or I am unseen, or I am unloved, or I am rejected, or I don't belong, then obviously feedback is catastrophic to ourself. And that can lead to anxiety problems, depression, like all these things. Right? But if foundationally we believe that we are good enough, or we do belong, or all these things, like those beliefs are healed, then feedback is just that. It's just an opportunity for us to get better. It doesn't challenge ourselves or our person at our core. And that's what I see often. Is when you said leaders don't have self-awareness, I disagree. What I see is they're in a protective mode. They have a protector part that is driving the bus, and that won't allow them to be self-aware because it's protecting them from the underlying belief that they have about themselves. And so
this is how people navigate their lives, right? Their whole lives.
Absolutely, right? And for people listening, like the movie Inside Out is basically similarly to how it works. And it's not that they don't have self-awareness, it's that protector part will literally distort reality in order to save you from that belief. And I can say this because for me, one of my protector parts would kill me to save me. Think about that for a distortive reality.
Well, I mean, I think when I say there's a lack of self-awareness, it's because a lot of this is happening on an unconscious level. And people need people like you to help them see what's going on, right? So self-awareness, becoming aware, awakening to what's happening unconsciously or reflexively
Mhm.
isn't always present, right? And needs that coaching. And so it's funny because as we were kind of moving from talking about culture to individual leaders and coaching individual leaders, I'm thinking about like the whole system here. How do we begin to prepare people for leadership when they're children? Because something about the way we're training people today is to, have that protective mechanism or that perfectionism. There was a great piece in the Atlantic, probably in like 2014 or 15, about gender differences and how girls are trained to be perfect and boys are trained to let things roll off their backs, and how this eventually translates into performance in the workplace. So these are the cultural norms that we adopt, right? But they're operating under the surface. Yeah, exactly.
Behind the gates. That's what we do. It's like the blind spots, I don't think are purposefully chosen. I think that they're just, what did our last guest, Dr. Steven, say? Scotomas, they're called, right? Like these are just legitimately pockets of their experience that they're not privy to.
Right. And that's what self-awareness is about, gaining awareness of what's going on. Why do I feel that way when my supervisor wants to give me feedback? Actually, Adam Grant, organizational psychologist at Wharton, has done a great job of helping people understand, how do you normalize that? How do you expose? It's like therapy, right? Like if you have a phobia, right? You go through, sometimes a successful route is to be exposed to that over and over again until it's no longer scary. And that's what we need to do with feedback. Like, ask your people for iterative, continual feedback to the point that you're like, no big deal. They're just giving me more feedback. Okay, I'm going to improve. And it just becomes a way for you to reach excellence. And then you start to get excited about it. Like, ooh, I did not know that. Oh my God, I'm doing this thing. And it never occurred to me that the introverts in the room, for example, might really struggle with this thing that I do, and I actually have gotten to that point where I kind of love it, but I'm also, I think what's frustrating is you have to really seek it out, because let's look at our performance reviews. Annual performance review?
Oh my gosh.
Come on. Like,
oh boy.
Number one, once a year. Number two, looking behind you. If I'm your manager and you haven't met your goals in the last year, who's failed here? That's me. I failed. I didn't help you. I didn't enable you. I didn't, I probably overloaded you with so much work. It was impossible for you to meet any of those goals. Like, this whole way of evaluating performance is completely backwards.
Oh my gosh.
But you know that, don't you, Susan?
Well, I think we are going to have a part 2 on that, because I cannot hardly wait to go deep with that whole concept, because I absolutely agree. It's just another example of how kind of lost in the sauce we are in regards to understanding what drives performance. And that's obviously why we specialize in mindset strategy architecture, right? Because we understand, like, it's 95% coming from that place that you don't understand, because it's hiding behind your gates, those choices that a leader makes all day long. So of course it's going to impact your performance. I think that's somewhere where we probably want to land our people, right? As we're thinking about all of the importance of this and how maybe, we really got to get going with the curiosity in terms of starting to turn those lights of self-awareness on. But yeah, that's the thing I want to ask and leave our audience with, right? In regards to the mission that you're on in this space and the impact that you desire to have on this world, what do you want the legacy of all this to be for you?
I just really love, so when I started out as an anthropologist, it was more I'm doing this research to understand what's happening so that I can tell you what's happening, right? It's more like, I'll explain, this is what I see. This is how I analyze this. Why I want to work with people and organizations is I actually want to apply that and make a difference in the lives of others. I want to impact people in a positive way. And it really excites me when someone comes to me with a complex problem and says, why isn't this team successful? Well, let's figure it out. Let's dive in there really qualitatively, design an intervention and see if it really makes a difference in their lives. And that's the whole thing. I just want to be able to make a positive impact on this world. And if everyone forgets Sarah Powell, but I made a difference, that would be plenty for me.
I love that. Now, Sarah, for everyone listening, where can people find more about you or follow your work?
You can certainly find me on LinkedIn, Sarah J. Powell. I'm in Philadelphia if you have to search for me. I am actually creating a website right now. So the URL will be sp2strategies.com, but it's being built right now. So it's not quite there yet. But again, once it is, it'll be on LinkedIn as well. So you can always find me. But I welcome your outreach. I welcome community. I love conversations like this. And I just think it provides energy and momentum for everyone who's trying to make these changes and who wants to benefit from these changes. So thank you, Rob and Susan, for what you are doing to make an impact. That's really valuable work.
No, thank you so much. And we'll drop Sarah's LinkedIn in the podcast notes. Also, she's connected to me, so you can find her there. For us, obviously, for all things leadership, coaching, consulting, talent optimization, psych safety, speaking, and more, head over to elitehighperformance.com. And also, if you enjoyed this podcast episode, hit subscribe and share it with the leaders in your life. Now, Susan, is there anything you want to leave us with today?
People be thinking we're a bunch of masochists on here saying, we love feedback. We get excited for feedback. We say feedback is gold in our locker room. That's literally the way that we think about it. And we do get as excited as you get when you're receiving it. But yeah, I think that listen, if this is feedback to you and this is illuminating maybe the fact that this is an area you haven't dived that deeply into, I'm really excited about the feedback that you're getting today, because I think you can see it's like nothing but opportunity for growth land. And who doesn't need some growth right now in their business or whatever area they're trying to lead in the world, right? So I just think this has been a great interview for whetting that appetite and getting people excited to go on that journey.
I love it too. And I think it's an incredible opportunity. And I'll leave everyone with a quote from Rumi, and he says, "Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open?"
I love that one, Rob.
And there's two elements to this quote. The first one is, do you even realize that you're in a prison? What bars have you put on yourself, or what bars have your conditioning or society or your parents put around you that you don't realize? And the second thing is, are you aware enough to see that there's a door and there's a way out? And I can tell you it takes an incredible amount of work to get there, but you can find the door and you can walk out of that door. And so that's where I want you to think about. Where's the protection showing up for you? What are you protecting yourself from? That's open that door of self-awareness. Sarah, we really appreciate you joining us today. Everybody, thank you so much for spending your time with us. This was an awesome episode. I'm all fired up now.
Me too.
That's right, everyone. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye, everyone.